Hello, everyone. This is Luke Johnson, and I am joined today for the second installment of our discussion on Melville's Moby Dick. Jonathan Cook, Dr. Jonathan Cook, the author of Inscrutable Malice, The Odyssey, Eschatology, and the Biblical Sources of Moby Dick, which is available on Amazon.com, will be finishing off the session that we failed to conclude last time. And start this session off, Dr. Cook? I mean, would you like for me to just launch into the first question, or would you like to say something, have an opening salvo before we begin?
No, you can just start your questions.
Fantastic, fantastic. All right. So I think where we left off, we were trying to consider some contemporary critics of Moby Dick, specifically whether or not they believed it to be a political allegory. And I wanted you to offer some considerations and commentary on whether or not that was a plausible idea.
Yeah, well, this line of criticism really began in the 1960s with three articles that were published. The most noteworthy was by a guy named Alan Heimert, who taught at Harvard, and his argument that was that Melville incorporated the political situation of the 1850, roughly the debate over the Compromise of 1850, so that there was a direct correlation to what was going on in Washington in terms of figuring out how to get beyond this crisis that emerged out of the end of the Mexican War, avoiding civil war, finding a way to appease the South. So he pointed to some interesting passages in Moby Dick that seemed to echo some of the language that you found in the political discussion at the time. But unfortunately, this line of argument, I think, has really not done very good service to an understanding of the novel, and other people have joined in the debate. I mean, the argument goes something like, Captain Ahab is a disguised version of John Calhoun, this senator from South Carolina who was fanatical about protecting slavery. And so the image of Ahab as a fanatic sort of reverberated with people who thought of, Calhoun in particular, because he was the leader of, the Southern Fire Eaters in Congress. But it also, some of the debate pointed to, the abolitionists of the time, so there was sort of an idea that somehow you could relate the book to the political situation. But the problem was, what does the white whale represent in this case? I mean,
that's
the idea of whiteness.
My question. Yeah.
Idea of whiteness, is that a racial category? Is it? I mean, why would someone who represents John Calhoun be on the hunt to exterminate a creature who's noted for his whiteness? I mean, Calhoun was an enemy to slaves being free, and so the allegorical coordinates really didn't line up very well. So
it's especially problematic since this white whale is indefatigable and it comes to destroy, the entire crew, right?
Yeah. So
unless we're trying to say about something about this pursuit of racial purity is ultimately self-destructive or something of that nature, unless you could try to make the argument in that way.
Yeah. So, but I mean, people have elaborated on this. I mean, it's the argument has continued, and say Andrew Delbanco's critical biography of Melville from about 2006 promoted this theory, of course, because he was a student of Heimert's at Harvard. And unfortunately, Nathaniel Philbrick, in a book called Why Read Moby Dick, um, he's a good sort of popular historian of nautical history, and he wrote a book about the Wilkes expedition, which went around the world and charted, as a sort of oceanographic expedition from 1838 to 1842. So this guy Nathaniel Philbrick endorsed this theory just a few years ago, say 5 years ago, in his book. We should all go out and read Moby Dick because it has this interesting allegorical description of America in 1850, 1851, which is exactly the wrong reason to go and read the book. Yes, there are. The book inevitably references slavery briefly and peripherally, and it there's certain historical elements that you can identify with the era, but they're much more general. And the fact is that the very first chapter of the book alludes to the fact that Ishmael ships out between this historic presidential election and the stunning defeat of the British in Kabul, which means that the election he's talking about is 1840, which Van Buren lost to William Henry Harrison, or rather Harrison, who died a month into office. But that was the election, and then the battle in Kabul is the first Afghan war, which happened some months after that. So Ishmael is sandwiching his expedition on the Pequod exactly when Melville himself left to go whaling, which is January 1841, which is well before the slavery crisis that is evoked by people talking about the book, reflecting the conditions of the country when Melville was writing. And the only real reference that Melville makes to contemporary politics is in Fast Fish and Loose Fish, when he talks about Mexico being a loose fish that America has now harpooned to claim ownership of. But it's stunningly silent about issues of slavery and race largely. The fact is that there are black sailors on the Pequod. The Fleece, the cook, and Pip, the cabin boy, and Dagu, who's an African, but they are not. None of them is identified as being a slave or a free man. They're just assumed to be just regular sailors on the ship, like everyone else. There are a couple of references to Pip. Pip's value if he was sold. Stubb refers to the fact that Pip's cowardice in jumping out of the whaleboat when they were trying to harpoon a whale has cost the Stubb a lot of money, because the whale got away because of Pip's fright at having the whale so close. And there's a reference to the amount of money that Pip would buy on the slave market, but it's really peripheral to the whole story.
So I wanted to ask you a question about the white whale. So I think it's a two-part question. In your estimation, did Melville have a concrete idea in mind for what the white whale represented that perhaps he shrouded in secrecy and kept only to himself? Or is it there and you really have to look for it and you can find it and find out what the white whale is definitively? Or is the white whale a bit of a Rorschach test, and whatever we project onto the white whale, everybody can have their own white whale. Anything that leads them to some sort of maniacal, uh,
Yeah.
intemperate sort of pursuit of something that will consume you. I don't think I've asked you this, or maybe I did in the last one, but I'd like to just have you weigh in on that
Yeah.
and
Well,
editorialize on that.
I think all three are true, but there I just want to emphasize you can find the meaning of the white whale if you think carefully enough. I mean, all of the things you're saying are true to a certain extent, but the fact is the white whale is, I call him a chaos monster because he is a representative of the natural world before human effort could create civilization. I mean, the fact is, Moby Dick emerges out of some of our oldest myths, and while it's a very realistically narrated story, the roots of the whale go back to Near Eastern mythology,
But
Canaanite mythology,
or like the
um,
Sumerians with the
Sumerian
fishmen.
mythology.
Yeah.
Yeah, myths of a hero who kills the creature and kills this monstrous creature, and then is proclaimed, the civilizing uh, power who deserves kingship, right? So you have the Canaanite myth. You have the Babylonian myth of the Enuma Elish, which is a wonderful story that you can read. It's been translated about
Can you say that again? I'd love
the
to check it.
Enuma Elish. It's the beginning, the first lines of the poem, and the title in English means "When on High." So it's about this revolt of a monstrous female sea creature with all of her denizens, and it took the hero comes to slay this creature, and then he's proclaimed the king. So this myth is represented in Canaanite mythology, but for Melville, the key myth came out of the book of Job, which is an adaptation of this Near Eastern mythology. And the creature, in this case, is called Leviathan. And Leviathan was the sea creature. Behemoth was the land creature. So Leviathan is a creature of chaos whom Ahab, as an aspiring messiah figure, wants to kill because he thinks that this creature represents all of the disorder and chaos and evil that afflicts humanity. Well, he's really creating a personal myth, because the fact is he wants to kill this creature because he has been um, had his leg removed in a very painful process, right? So he's a survivor of a very significant trauma, and he's vowed vengeance against this creature. But the fact is, he presents himself as a culture hero a couple of times in the novel, but his vengeance is really a private one, and that is what makes him morally offensive to us as readers, right? Because he puts his own private agenda ahead of his crew members, right? He causes all their deaths except for Ishmael, of course, and he creates his pursuit of the whale. He magnifies it into a sort of mission to test whether this monster is really a surrogate for God, right? So God, in the book of Job, when God appears in the whirlwind, he tells Job a lot of things about how insignificant Job is in the larger scheme of things, and how he had nothing to do with creating the world. And the final taunt against Job is, can you put a hook through Leviathan? Here's a sea creature that I personally put under my control, because without my being around, he would have destroyed civilization, right? So this creature is sort of representative of all the forces of nature that humans can't control. And that's how God taunts Job. And it's unclear in the Old Testament, because Leviathan shows up in some of the Psalms, and there's a little bit of out of ambiguity if Leviathan is a surrogate of God or he is an enemy of God. But the fact is, Leviathan has been contained by the Hebrew God, and the risk is that at some point he will emerge in all his chaos bearing ferocity at
Well,
some
he would.
point.
I would think it would stand to reason that he would be a surrogate, right? Because as so long as he's part of creation, he's
Yeah,
part of physical reality.
yeah. Well, that's what
He would.
Ahab assumes. But in the older myths, of course, this creature, in polytheistic cultures of Canaan and Sumerian culture, Babylonian culture, the sea creature is the enemy of civilization, right? But of course, in Christianity or Judaism, right, there's one God, so whatever evil creature is out there had to be somehow um, maybe under the control of the deity, because you can't have any creatures who were totally independently evil of a God who has proclaimed that all creation is good.
Who
So
knows?
the
Maybe,
end,
yeah,
yeah,
maybe he's imprisoned under the ice of Antarctica.
yeah, Leviathan. Well, it's a very convincing myth because we all know that chaos can emerge
Oh
any
yeah.
time, in the world, in either politics or in the natural world with earthquakes and tsunamis and whatnot. But in the ancient world, the whole myth evolved from the idea of the sea being the element of chaos, and classic historians and comparative mythologists think that maybe it was the flooding of flat areas in Babylonia that created this sort of initial myth of the sea as an invading evil power. Um, or in terms of Canaanite culture, it would have been the Eastern Mediterranean
So
as an unruly element.
so if that is how we are to interpret fundamentally what the white whale is, what do you make of all these efforts to construe the white whale differently? Do you have any?
Well, I
Do you have,
mean, I think any richly symbolic book deserves to have people thinking about all the possibilities that it suggests. And the fact is that the white whale is the epitome of Ahab's outrage at the world. So uh, you could say, well, the white whale is whatever um, evil things in the world sort of you become obsessed by, right? Um, it's I mean, not maybe the whale itself, but the whale is a symbol of everything that is against human flourishing, say.
well,
But I mean, you really have to look at, I mean, to get the most out of the book, you really have to see it as an allegory and to see it in its context of the larger traditions of Christianity and Christian mythology, because that's the tradition Melville was working in. He's like Shakespeare. He's immersed in the myths of his culture. He's not writing, political allegories as though he's reading the congressional record, every week or something. He's working with these big Shakespearean themes in his mind to show an authentic tragic hero who is representative of the will. I mean, the other thing about Ahab is he's the product of a culture of reform. So, America in the mid 19th century, 1830s and 40s was just chock full of all kinds of reform movements: abolitionism, temperance, prison reform, dress reform, um, trying to remedy poverty, rescue women from prostitution. So it was a culture when there was this huge onslaught against every kind of social evil you can imagine. So Moby Dick is really an allegory of the ultimate reformer, Captain Ahab, who is trying to eliminate really the source of all evil, which is projected onto this living creature, but ultimately is traceable to the God that he no longer believes in and that he thinks is torturing him as a suffering human being.
What was the
But
question I was going to ask you?
so anyway, I mean, you can get into the drama of the chase and whatever, and you don't have to really worry that much about um, the symbolism of the white whale. But I mean, you really should honor what you see on the page, in chapter, the famous chapter on the quarterdeck of when Ahab says what the white whale represents to him. It's really a religious and mythological creature that he talks about in that chapter. Um,
I
and
remember
in
why I
the,
wanted.
yeah,
I remember why I wanted to ask you, because it seems like from the little bit of research outside of the text that I've been able to do, that it seems like it's kind of this a foregone conclusion that Ahab is um, just mad, just a man completely consumed. Do you
well,
do you think there's room for a more nuanced interpretation of Ahab as there being a method to his madness, that there being some sort of profound philosophical
well,
rationality to what he's doing?
I think what he illustrates is the fact that people can be selectively crazy.
Ah,
Uh, I mean,
I know something about that.
he has the things that make him paranoid and crazy, but he's also a rational human being who can do his duty as a captain of a ship and order people around and think about what he's doing. And he can also view his obsessions objectively. So, I mean, that's what's interesting for me is that he is illustrates the fact that insanity, um, there's a very uh, there's a spectrum really between the totally sane person and the totally crazy person, and that uh, fact is was recognized at the time. There was something called monomania, which was a
Yeah,
term. It's
yeah.
found in the book, and it was something that was a new kind of buzzword in psychology at the time. That you can have an obsession about one thing, right? But then the rest of your life, you seem to be normal, right? But you get so caught up in something, you become kind of obsessed by it. And that was symptomatic, I think, of America at the time because the country was really madly in pursuit of new economic opportunities and it's this social reform. People thought people got crazy about eliminating slavery and eliminating alcohol from everyone's life. So it was symptomatic of the country that had sort of pioneered this new freedom, political freedom, and it was thought that without the sort of older institutional structures you found in older European culture, that people would turn into monomaniacs because either they were trying to get rich quick or they were trying to perfect the world according to some of their religious ideas. So the whole culture had this sort of predisposition to this obsessive sort of mindset, and it was written about quite a bit at the time.
I'm so American centric. It's hard for me to imagine a human condition that doesn't involve monomania. But maybe I need to do some more traveling.
Yeah, well, we live in a 24/7 monomaniac world.
But
Um,
man, yeah, I find that maybe that was the case in Melville's day, but at least in the contemporary situation, I can't find. It's so hard to find anyone who cares about anything. it seems the modus operandi, at least in this stage of modernity, is detachment and passivity, which to me, I don't know, I would trade that for a bunch of monomaniacs, or at least I would, at least in theory. I'd like to see some passion and some color in this world of ours, but I don't know. Or do you think it's
Well,
changed? I don't know. Careful what I wish for, right?
yeah. Well, I really wouldn't know how to evaluate that.
Yeah,
Um,
probably
but
not a scientific question.
but
I
yeah, another thing to think about though for Ahab is something that excuse me, a lot of readers don't realize, which is that part of Ahab's obsessive quest has to do with this concept of phantom limb syndrome that he suffers from, because
yeah,
he's lost his leg, and as some people know, if you lose a limb, you can have these terrible pains where the limb should be, so that it
right.
seems as though you actually still have the limb on you, your arm or your leg or whatever, and it's not there. Um, so, there's something very baffling about this, and only in the last few decades have researchers, particularly a guy named B.S. Ramachandran, put together the idea that we have a somatosensory cortex in our brain. It's kind of on either side of the brain where all of the sensory nerves come together, and that when you lose a limb, the feeling for that limb, the nerves actually are still active in your brain, and you can have confusion, so that if you get a scratch on your bottom of your chin, you can feel as though your missing arm is giving you pain or something like that, right? So the whole receptors in the brain can obviously lead to this terrible pain that is coming from nowhere because you don't have the limb anymore. So for Ahab, I think his idea was that this invisible God is torturing him for no reason. So he's got to get back at him because he has these excruciating pains. There's a chapter that describes when his leg was bitten off and how he raved, and he was in agony for weeks on end during this voyage back. And so his motivation for seeking out the whale as a surrogate of the deity has a lot to do with the fact that he's bearing this terrible wound that has, first of all, destroyed his sort of body ego. He's very self-conscious about losing his masculine powers to walk and whatnot, but also this gratuitous pain that he feels where his leg should be, and that he ascribes to this invisible deity who is sort of hiding behind the figure of the white whale.
Be really interesting to reimagine some of these themes and some of these neurocortical cortexes, or whatever they're called, in light of the advancements that are being made in
Yeah,
robotic extensions and for amputees and things of that nature, and maybe apply Melville and the neuroscience to these new
yeah,
developments in technology. I don't know if you thought much about that. I see a lot of I see a lot of people who've returned from war zones who are getting um, all these updates, all these if they lost a limb or something to that effect. That's a topic for another day. So
yeah.
I'm digressing a little bit, but it raises some interesting philosophical, scientific, neuroscience issues. Um, so, I mean, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about like some of the pragmatic import of the text. Um, and unless you wanted to go on a little bit more about religious allegory, but I think we've said a fair amount. Unless you want to say more.
Uh, no, I mean, I think we've covered a lot. I just would say that for me, the interesting thing about Ahab is that I mean, he's got multiple identities in terms of his literary and mythical forebears. But if you look at his chief biblical models, first of all, there's King Ahab,
I was going to
who
say,
you
I
know
came
who
up.
is
Yeah,
who is
who is?
well, Ahab was the the 8th century king of Israel, who in the Old Testament it says he angered God more than any other king of Israel, because he married Jezebel,
All right.
who is a Canaanite woman, and he allowed the worship of Baal into Israel, and he
That
allowed
that's
these
not good.
Baal-like temples. Yeah. So when the historical books of the Old Testament were written, they were all implicitly thinking of the destruction of Jerusalem in 586 by the Babylonians, the destruction of Jerusalem. And they think, well, why did this happen? Well, it's because some of our leaders abandoned Yahweh. They were unfaithful to Yahweh. So when they looked back to Ahab and saw him marrying this foreign princess, they wrote him up. They gave him a really bad rap. We have no idea what the historical truth about Ahab was, but he was killed in a battle with the Syrians. And Elijah was the prophet who denounced him for being unfaithful to Yahweh, and he and his wife were trying to had this guy Naboth killed because they wanted to take over his vineyard. So they were guilty of judicial murder. Um, so Ahab is this figure who's morally vile, right? And that is the Ahab that we think of when we think of all the blasphemous speeches he gives on the Pequod, and some of his more tyrannical aspects of his personality. But on the other hand, Ahab is a very eloquent uh, embodiment of Job. In the book of Job, which features the figure of Job painfully complaining about his treatment by God for taking all of his belongings away, killing his children, this disaster that happens to him. And so he has, Ahab's speeches you can match up with some of the agonized complaints of Job. So, the morally defensible side of Ahab and his outrage at the treatment of humanity and his own treatment by a seemingly cruel God, all of these stem from aspects of the figure of the patriarch Job complaining that he did nothing wrong for God to take everything away from him. Of course, the reason God did this was that Satan, he's not the New Testament Satan. This is Satan as the sort of district attorney in the Persian Empire. That was where his role came from. He challenged God, saying, look at Job. He's really devout, but I bet if you took everything away from him, he would curse you to your face, right? So the reason Job is devout is only because God has rewarded him so bountifully. So that's the origin of Job's trials, right? A contest between God and the Satan, his prosecuting attorney. So anyway, it's too bad people who read the Moby Dick now just don't have the background in all of these biblical uh, lore. But I mean, you can certainly enjoy the book without knowing anything about this, but it just makes it a richer experience if you do know that this book emerges out of American Protestant culture. Um,
Yeah, and just to help people along, I looked up where actually the Ahab story occurs in the Bible if people want to familiarize themselves with this. And it primarily is spoken about in 1 Kings chapters 16 through 22.
yeah,
So,
yeah.
and by the way, that was You've got it nearly. I was looking over a quick summarization of it. You've got it kind of memorized off the top of your head. Again,
Well, he's a
something I envy of you.
yeah. Well, again, there's a little bit of scholarship out there. I read a modern biblical scholar's study of Ahab and just how much credence we can give to the biblical writers, and it's you don't realize it, but you're reading basically Hebrew propaganda against a king who may be completely different from what we uh, uh, are reading. But in any case, he
So it's very,
he's a representative enemy of the deity.
it's always a very interesting thing when you're dealing with the Bible is, you know, a lot of the events in the Bible. If you talk to a Christian or a Jewish person, they would say that the Bible sort of validates itself, that it's this record of these actual events. But if someone is skeptical of the authenticity of the Bible to begin with, you need outside sources. You need secular sources to sort of legitimate it or bring it bring it in, bring it into conversation with it. Um, to see what historical texts there are out there that perhaps give a different view of who King Ahab might have been. I don't know if you have found any on that particular subject.
Yeah, well, I mean, 8th century is going back pretty far. We really don't have much in the way of any evidence. I mean, if you just think of ancient Greece, I mean, the 5th century is the great explosion of Greek culture and literature, but I mean, that's kind of the threshold. You had writing before that, obviously, but there's just very little in terms of records before the 6th century.
It's very interesting. I'd love to, at some future date, explore the idea of when the modern conception of the historian came to be and when people believed such record keeping and
Yeah,
development of narratives became an important thing, because it would seem kind of off the jump that that would be important, but that seems to
yeah,
be something that evolved over time.
yeah,
The role of the historian.
yeah, yeah. Well,
I mean,
I'm no expert in biblical chronology. I mean, a lot of their record keeping was surprisingly accurate from what we know today, but there's always going to be a bias one way or the other, um, in terms of what how religion was going to influence their political world.
I guess we're getting into probably
Subset of ideas. Yeah.
a
So
subset of
let's.
ideas, which is a good subset of ideas. I would just say this subset of ideas would probably be labeled the philosophy of history or something
Yeah.
like that. So, people are interested in the evolution of science. You look at the philosophy of science. If you're interested in the evolution of history, I guess we're looking at the
Yeah.
philosophy of history. So let's look at some practical questions here. Could go all day about the philosophical ones. That's my impulse. But maybe you could tell us something about the contemporary reception of Melville's novel and its impact on Melville's life.
Yeah. So the book was published in England in October 1851, and November 1851 came out in America. His publisher was Harper Brothers, um, and he was really banking on this being his breakthrough, novel, so to speak. I mean, he built up his reputation um, in the late 1840s, right? And I mean, he was a known entity, so people were interested in what he had to say, but he uh, he had some real bad luck. I mean, first of all, the epilogue to the novel didn't um, make it to his British publisher. So the novel was published initially without the epilogue, which explains how Ishmael survived. And this was a complete accident. And so when reviewers read the book, they said, wow, this is an interesting book, but it seems to be structurally flawed because we have no idea how this figure of Ishmael made it through the sinking of the ship. And so he got some bad press for that. Also, he got some bad press because of the supposed, blasphemous content of the book, because the British were very sensitive about this. They had strict rules about blasphemy, much more than America at the time. And some of the passages had to be touched up by the editor. And so even toned down, the book still offended some British reviewers. So the initial reviews that came from England to New York were relatively negative or mixed. And at the time, New York reviewers keyed their responses to a lot of books by what the British reviewers said about it. So American reviewers also had bad things to say about Melville's supposed irreligion. I mean, they had the advantage that they had the ending of the book properly in place, the epilogue. But the worst thing for Melville was the literary world, which was published or edited by his friend Everett Dykink and his brother George Dykink. They published a two-part review that it gave high praise to certain parts of the book, but it also was very harsh on Melville's, irreligious aspects to the novel. I mean, it wasn't that noticeable. In terms of the overall review, it wasn't like the prime aspect, but it hurt Melville a great deal that his friend had written a review with this sort of barbed criticism of his religion, his irreligion. So Melville was very mad at this guy, and he soon broke off his friendship with him a few weeks later. So the book did not sell the way he wanted it to. It sold only, I think, about 1,200 copies in the first 6 months or so, which is a tiny amount considering that Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin would sell 100,000 copies in the first, well, no, maybe, I forget. If it was 100, maybe it was 300,000 copies. But
didn't
this
Melville
was.
didn't Melville understand that he was ahead of his time? Didn't he understand the reading public wasn't ready for him? That
Well,
they were
yeah,
going
he knew that. He knew that, but he knew that if he wrote a really good story, that people would read him as a popular author and maybe get his sales up. But the problem was he desperately needed the money because he had unwisely borrowed $2,050, which, if you multiply that by 25, is probably what you get, an equivalent sum of money, so maybe like $30,000. He borrowed this money from a supposed friend of his from his the town of Lansingburg, where he lived when he was a teenager. And this guy, T.D. Stewart, gave him a loan for 5 years on this money, and Melville used it to fix up his new house in Pittsfield, Arrowhead, and make renovations, fix up the barn, build a little porch or piazza, as he calls it. And so he borrowed that money, and when he wasn't getting much in the way of royalties, he started defaulting on his loan. I think a year or less after he borrowed the money, right? So he was in default on this loan consistently for the next 5 years, and he finally was rescued from what would have been bankruptcy or the disaster of having his property seized by his father-in-law, um, who was his name was Lemuel Shaw, and he was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Massachusetts. So Lemuel Shaw stepped in and rescued him from bankruptcy and deeded over the property to his wife. So Melville kind of was out of the picture in terms of finances at that point. But I mean, he still had to make a living. So financially, he was in more and more desperate situation in 1852 to 1856. Right, he became a magazine writer in 1853, but then he wrote his novel Pierre, which was published in the summer of 1852, and that was an even worse disaster than Moby Dick. It was never published in England because they wouldn't accept it in its current form. So that was even worse for Melville, because critics thought he had lost his mind because the book was very challenging, morally speaking. It was kind of like a Jude the Obscure or Tess of the D'Urbervilles. You know, everyone was up in arms about its sexual morality. So the upshot was that Moby Dick, Melville thought of it as his breakthrough novel, and it ended up being like a millstone around his neck that was going to,
Did he ever get
drown
to?
him
Did
in
he
a
ever get
sea
to?
of bankruptcy.
Did he ever get to enjoy the fruits of his labor? I mean, could it? What did he ever
Well,
see any of the recognition that he
I
and
think
we all believe he deserved?
he got occasional compliments from people, but there was no, I mean, the critical establishment in the 1850s was not really very stellar, and you didn't have a really strong group of people reviewing books.
Were they just dumb, or could they not get past the
Well, they were
so-called
stuck.
irreligiosity of the text? Because I don't necessarily find it to be an irreligious text. I mean,
Well, you have to think of
there's
it
so many
as,
themes, so many explorative themes there.
well, you have to think of this as America as its most uh, Protestant and evangelical time in its history. Protestant evangelical values permeated the culture. Um, and there was a very constricting ideology of, um, you know, domesticity. Women were confined to the home, men had to go out and work. Um, and the woman was the moral guardian of the household, so she had to be very, pure and devout, and all the children had to get their Bible lessons every week. So there was a pervasive aura of evangelical religion, and half of the books published at the time were religious books, sermons, um, you know, older religious books that had become classics, or Pilgrim's Progress, or moral tales for children. The Tract Society, the American Tract Society, issued millions of copies of little children's stories with a Christian theme to them. So Melville was really kind of upsetting the apple cart. Even though it seems mild to us today, uh, he was being pretty daring in his book.
Hmm.
And only people, a few people who stepped back from the culture could appreciate him.
So then, riddle me this: how did he go from this very tepid response to possibly? I mean, I mission accomplished, right? I mean, he proved to everyone that an American could write an epic that rivaled, anything that Homer did. How did he
Yeah.
how did he change that perception in a
Well,
matter of
I mean,
100 years? Or not him, but how did his reputation change?
he was lucky in that a few readers remembered him. I mean, he pretty much disappeared from the radar in the 1860s and 70s. I mean, he was writing poetry, but not
Yeah.
many people were reading the poetry. But his
But that's what
English
brought us together.
his English admirers kept his knowledge of Moby Dick and his other works alive. So some of the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood were reading Melville, and some other later 19th century English novelists. I mean, there were groups of readers in northern England, who got together and talked about Moby Dick, and so they kept the flame alive.
I'm
And some
so
of
ignorant.
them
Can you tell me
arts.
about this pre-Raphaelite? I mean
Uh,
by that.
well, um, the the head of the pre-Raphaelites, um, Rossetti, Dante Gabriel Rossetti. He led in a movement in British aesthetic theory in the 1850s. He was a poet. His sister was a poet as well. He had a brother who was a writer too, Michael Rossetti. But anyway, they formed a group of young artists who championed the European art before Raphael, so pre-Renaissance art. So they went back. They sort of were a movement towards an older primitivism in painting, and they were kind of in revolt against the establishment at the time. And so they were, sort of a vanguard of a new aesthetic movement, and so that Rossetti was part of it. William Morris was part of this, and some of these people later on in the 1880s, 1870s, 80s knew about Melville, and they said, "Hey, how come America has forgotten about this great writer?" So they kept the memory alive, and so they were just selective individuals here and there who remembered these books, and it's almost like
Did anyone come to have power? See, I look at this like so when I was doing music for years and years and years, right?
yeah,
Like I'd come across about so much music, and there would be these individuals that would toil in obscurity who I thought were geniuses, and
yeah,
there are these other people that were just very mediocre, but because very high profile individuals said, "Behold, world,
yeah.
I have the next discovery that will change your artistic consciousness," and then just hordes of people would latch onto it. Was there an individual that came out who had maybe that kind of authority? People looked up to him and could just totally change the narrative on who
Yeah.
Melville was, or was it just this incremental thing of just
Well,
it's like a slow fire?
it,
It burned until we have him today.
yeah. But it's kind of a combination of both, because it's interesting to think of Melville's rediscovery. And I don't want to sound ridiculous, but you know what happened after the death of Jesus Christ, right? These people sort of had this memory of him, and these little groups of people kept alive they had his sayings, the sayings of Jesus, and then they wove the narratives about his life, and so you ended up with these three different gospel communities that correspond to Matthew, Mark, and John, um, and Luke. For Melville, you had these clusters of readers, but then at the turn of the century, there was an attempt to get a biography written, but the publisher backed out on it. So the first biography came with Raymond Weaver in the early 1920s. But before that, actually, D.H. Lawrence had written an essay on Melville in Studies in American
Oh,
Literature, and that was an important endorsement because Lawrence was
there you
very
go.
enthusiastic, and Raymond Weaver's book opened up, told us a little bit about Melville's life. Of course, he perpetrated some horrible misstatements and factual inaccuracies. But the 1920s is when Melville finally caught on, and people say, well, America had to finally grow up. They went through World War I. We were suddenly a little more intellectually mature. We'd gone through this horrible ordeal of War. We've been exposed to European culture and modernism. So the country's intellectual elites became a lot more sophisticated, and they were ready to embrace a figure like Melville, who was a kind of an avant-garde writer in his own time, who needed to obviously get his full recognition. And so it came in the 1920s, and then by the 1950s, he was part of the college curriculum as a classic author, and Moby Dick as his central text.
So I have two questions for you. I have two that are unprepared that I'm probably going to catch you off guard with, but they relate to our sort of modern situation, and then I should wrap it up.
Yeah.
And so there are two things I want to ask. Is a Melville on the on the landscape today? What do you think about that?
What
One out
today?
there. Do you believe there's a Melville on the
You mean
landscape today?
an
Like the,
equivalent writer
yeah. A modern day
who is who
Melville.
is who is not getting the recognition he deserves?
Yeah, and then maybe 60 years
Uh,
after his death, we're going to be talking about him in the same way.
I don't know. I mean, to me, the the when I read contemporary fiction, um, the only writers who really impress me with the sort of beautiful insight and stylistic brilliance and sort of broadness of vision. Well, Jonathan Franzen is one writer that I really admire, and you read his work and you're really swept up into a whole world. I mean, it's obviously very different from what Melville is
I,
writing about.
is there
Um,
one book of his that you prefer more than others?
well, I mean, The Corrections is an amazing book,
Okay.
um, and Purity, a newer novel, is fascinating. I think it has a sort of flawed ending, but it's an amazing story, especially in view of contemporary political events. But then I don't know. I mean, there are a lot of slightly older writers who are alleged to be, brilliant, offbeat classics like William Gaddis, whom I
Hmm.
haven't read. I haven't read much Pynchon, although I don't know. I think these days Pynchon he's kind of producing. I mean, he's pretty old by now, and I think he's just kind of repeating himself in some ways. Um, but if there are these writers out there, I think we're in a much better position to promote their work and to have many more people who will be able to recognize them. And I mean, there are more media available to spread the word about them, in terms of the web.
So we
uh,
think, though, who knows what blindness we could have to some genius, you know?
yeah, well, that's
Yeah.
always something you have to think about,
Yeah.
because the values of the marketplace are not the values that will ultimately lead to recognizing the greatest literary artists out there.
So something else I was going to ask you, I was going to have you weigh in on this. I was listening to a lecture and someone floated the idea that Spielberg may have been motivated by Moby Dick when he was making Jaws.
Well, yeah, definitely. Yeah, no, that's true. Yeah, I mean,
Well,
you
that I'd
can.
never heard that before, but I
Yeah,
mean, I can
yeah,
hear it.
definitely true. There are all kinds of cultural influences out there, um, well known and not so well known, which is to be expected for a classic like
So
this. And
it's a pretty obvious analogy, pretty obvious connection there with Jaws.
yeah, yeah. I mean, I don't know. I mean,
I think
to me,
uh,
I've just heard that. I mean, I haven't seen the movie recently, so
I don't I think I was too young to
yeah.
to watch Jaws. I understand the basic premise of it, but it
But
makes it makes you makes you want to go watch it now in light of our conversation.
yeah,
All right. Well, we should bring this to a close. I really
okay,
enjoyed this session. We'll have to figure out what we do next. I mean, I'm happy to
okay,
keep doing Melville, and we should
okay,
so get a copy of that. But I want to thank you
okay.
for doing this recording with us today. I really
Yeah,
enjoyed it.
yeah, I enjoyed it too.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Cook. I'll talk to you soon.